Hello, and welcome to the Hope Relentless Marriage Podcast. Chad and Sarah Gale here, and we are so happy that you have joined us today. We're going to be talking about some good stuff that you don't want to miss. So, very excited for the topic today. And I do want to remind you that marriages impact families, families impact communities, and communities impact the world. So, what you are doing by listening to this podcast, by investing in your marriage, listening to other podcasts, going to seminars, whatever it may be to just grow your marriage is phenomenal. It's making a difference. So, keep on growing and keep on learning.
Yeah, well done. As you're listening to this podcast or investing in your marriage and your relationship in whatever ways you do, keep at it. Today, we are talking about an important topic. And it's important as I introduce this to realize that relationships are nuanced. They're dynamic. So the things that we talk about, they're ideas, they're questions, they're potential solutions for you to consider. It's not a one size fits all. But Sarah Gale, I do believe that there are some patterns and some principles of relationships that are thriving that we can learn from. They're things that we implement in our life, and they're things that we learn from others. And so today, what we are going to talk about is boundaries, specifically boundaries with the opposite sex. And so almost thinking of this as ideas on how to affair-proof your marriage. As Hope Relentless counsels couples, one of the most difficult things for a couple to overcome is an affair. I mean, you've experienced this, Sarah Gale. Maybe walk us through a little bit, just some of those challenges, and then we'll jump into some of the boundaries.
Okay. So I just want to be clear. When he says that I've experienced it, it's not that I've experienced an affair or had an affair. It's more that I work with couples who have had affairs, experienced it, the whole gambit. And it truly is one of those very tender elements, in the counseling where we're looking at, what happened? How did this happen? And there are a lot of steps, a lot of circumstances that lead into this. And one thing I just want to start the conversation with is just a little bit of John Gottman research. He's a marriage researcher, and he has done some extensive work with marriages in general, but also specifically affairs. And so one of the things that just stands out to me is the reason for affairs, whether it's physical or emotional. And what he says is it's loneliness. And that's a human feeling. And so it's something that we all are susceptible to. And so when I'm working with people with affairs, just because I haven't personally experienced one, it doesn't lower my compassion and my empathy for those who are going through it. And it doesn't cause me to judge someone who has participated in any kind of an affair, because I know we're all human and none of us are above reproach. But what we're going to be talking about today are some things that we can put in place ahead of time that can help us when it comes to those scenarios and those circumstances that lead us into affairs.
Yeah, and so we'll probably do a separate podcast or conversation around what to do after an affair. This is really the pre. What can we do to minimize the likelihood that an affair takes place? It's kind of like if I was riding a bike and I wear a helmet, I'm not saying I want to launch myself off the bike and hit my head, but it's something I can do preventative. So if something happens, I've taken an extra intentional step to protect myself. And so oftentimes when we bring up boundaries, the first reaction from one or both people is excuses or justification. We love each other. We would never do that. And I think this idea from Gottman around loneliness is an interesting one, because I think as people, we can look at our lives and most of us have probably experienced some dynamic of loneliness. So it's not attractedness. It's not being attracted to somebody else. It's not necessarily somebody else coming up and hitting on you or some other dynamic. This idea of loneliness realizes, hey, we should all probably be aware of what are some additional steps that we can take. And so in this concept of boundaries, I think the heart and the motivation are important because we're going to share some ideas of things that we do that can quickly be dismissed by by other couples or by other individuals, and that's fine. And I think the other thing that people react when they hear boundaries is control.
Yeah, that's
And
good.
that's not necessarily the same thing. The result could be similar, like the
Mhm.
boundary in place. There could be somebody who is just controlling, and that is their heart and that is their perspective, to control their spouse, to know where their spouse is, to have to approve what their spouse does or does not do. That's also not what we're talking about. What we're talking
Mhm.
about is a couple looking at where could potential threats come from, and where are we vulnerable as individuals to potentially, out of the norm, fall into an affair. Now, I
Yeah,
say fall into because there are very few couples, there's very few individuals that wake up and in the middle of a healthy, thriving relationship or marriage go, you know what? I'm cheating on my spouse today. Who's going to be the lucky person that I have an
oh
affair with?
gosh. Uh-huh.
The couples that we work with that have gone through this, that's not how it started, right? It started differently. I know for me, generationally, my dad had an affair on my mom, and my grandpa had an affair on my grandma. Now, thankfully, they were able to work through their relationships, but there's still scars. There's still impact from those relationships. For me, when I was a teenager, was when that happened with my parents, and it marked me as a young man. And so there are consequences. So this is a long way of trying to introduce this idea of boundaries is all about looking at the marriage and saying, how do we protect our marriage in good times and in bad times? Are there things that we can do to protect our marriage? How do we prioritize our marriage ahead of time to minimize those vulnerable moments where we're lonely or where we're fighting or where there's discontent or where there's pain for whatever reason? How in those moments do we still protect our marriage from an affair?
Right. Right. That's good. And I do want to add to that that what boundaries are not is they are not a sign of weakness in a relationship. On the contrary, when we set boundaries in place, it's a sign of wisdom and strength. And it's recognizing that, you know what? Not everyone is for our marriage. And and truly, I have had people that I have counseled who literally think that when they are in a relationship or when they're trying to pursue a relationship with a married man, a lot of times that's the scenario here. So it's oftentimes the women pursuing relationships with the married man. It makes them feel seen and makes them feel special because if he's willing to leave his family and willing to risk it all on her, then that does something for her. And so what we have are people walking around with extremely low self-esteem, looking for love in all the wrong places,
Yeah.
truly. And I think that it should alert us to the fact that not everyone is for a marriage. They don't respect this ring. They don't respect the fact that we are married. So if we're not putting these boundaries in place for our relationship and if we're not seeking agreement with our spouses, nobody else is. And we could have people pursuing us intentionally because they want us to be in a relationship with them to show whatever it is that they need to be validated for. So that brings me into seeking agreement, like I mentioned, with our spouse. It's not about what other people are doing, what other couples are doing. We want to make sure that we are in agreement with what our spouse and ourselves, what we are doing, because it might look different than other people. And so boundaries that you have with your spouse might be different than boundaries your best friend has. But we want to be aware of that because one thing that can come up is certain people are just more flirty. And
Yeah.
if someone is if someone is more flirty, it's like, oh, it's just my personality. And I'm thinking, okay, I see you, but I'm gonna watch you
Yeah.
because that's not what we do in my relationship. And so there's gonna be a distance that you have a boundary that I set up when it comes to whether our families get together or not, because that's not what we're trying to do. That's not the integrity that we're trying to put on our relationship or the lack of integrity for us, because that's different for us. Does that make, am I making sense or am I kind of rambling? I
Yeah,
got
a little bit of both, a little bit of sense, a little bit of rambling, but
making
but I
dollars.
think I make it terrible jokes. Um, it's a good thing we're not professional comedians. We would have nowhere to live
Hey,
and no food to eat. But
I
um,
think, but okay. You're
we
right.
make each other laugh, so that works. But I think some of it comes back to the heart and the perspective, right? When our
Mhm.
objective is to prioritize our marriage, it changes a little bit how we look at situations, right?
Mhm.
If my primary objective is to kind of do what I want when I want, well, then there's going to be times where the marriage takes a back seat to that, right? But on
Yeah.
the flip side, if my priority is my marriage and is my family, then there's going to be times where my convenience or where my preference takes a back seat.
Mhm.
And, so you said something. So I want to expand on some of the Gottman stuff that you shared because I think it's interesting. But it's in that research, it said of affairs, only 11 become long-term relationships, right? So
11%.
11%. So out of 100, 11 become relationships. And
Crazy.
then out of those 11, it said that 75% of those, so 7 or 8 of those 11 out of 100 end in divorce. And the reason being, ironically, not ironic, logical, mistrust, lack of trust, right?
Mhm.
So even this idea of how we would fix loneliness by having an affair, that essentially only 3 out of 100 of those relationships
Wow.
survive. Like
Wow.
that's, if we're trying to, like, on a super practical, which makes no sense. You can't go down an illogical path and then apply logic down the path, but only 3 out of 100 of those relationships thrive. So just on a practical level, a mathematical statistical dynamic, like that's probably not the path to go down to for a
Yeah.
thriving, healthy relationship. I think most people would agree with that. But
Yeah.
now I want to talk about some practical boundaries, some ideas that maybe you and I implement for the purpose of trying to affair proof our marriage, affair
Okay.
proof our relationship. So, one of those on a practical level is you and I do not spend time individually with people of the opposite sex.
Mm.
We just
Mhm.
don't do it, right?
Right. Right. Yeah.
And but I would say that's pretty rare.
It is very extremely.
And a lot of people think it's an extreme step. We've had friends say, "Hey, so and so, like, can you pick them up?" Right? And maybe Sarah Gale's not available. And so it's my friend's wife. And the answer is just no, unless I have a kid or they have a kid, or there's got to be somebody else that can
Mhm.
go with us. I remember years ago when I was on staff at a church in LA, I took public transportation home because, like, I don't remember, something happened with the car, and somebody else offered to take me home, but that person was a woman, and we would have been alone in the car. And so I just took public transportation home. Incredibly inconvenient, took significantly longer. And so maybe you can share, Sergio, why did we make this drastic decision around not being alone with people of the opposite sex?
It's so funny. It's like, why? In the sense of why would we do that? Or why? Like what I'm trying to catch your tone. He's like, I just did it. Yeah, I think because we recognize for ourselves in general, we are not above reproach. But then also just knowing the stories after stories of people, succumbing to these temptations, especially I think one of the things to look at is how consistent are things like this happening. Like if it starts with one car ride and then it starts with another car ride and then maybe you go get some lunch together, and so before you know it, you're seeing the same person consistently in different scenarios, and that's when comfortability starts to arise. And in the scenario of a car, it's almost like when we step out of that car, like we want to be good witnesses just in general. Like we don't want to appear as anything other than we are. And so as we step out of that car, if we had someone at the house that was the opposite sex, they step out of our house, it's like we don't want to have an appearance of anything. And I know that it's not about what other people think all the time, and it's not about altering our lives to satisfy others. But for us, that was important in the sense of we did want to have a standard that we were showing our sons, that other people who might look to us, that they were seen. And this is why what matters, what's important is what will you do with your spouse? What is important to you guys? And as long as you're in agreement, then that's great. Because if Chad was in agreement, if I wasn't in agreement regarding that, we would need to talk through that, and we would need to come to a place where we were in agreement.
Yeah, and we can talk about that a little bit in a moment. I mentioned earlier, I was on staff at a church back in LA. And there was a situation where within staff, an emotional affair took place.
Mm-hmm.
And so leadership decided within the windows, all of the offices, they made just a change. They put windows in all of the doors. Like I remember the facility manager, who was a guy who reported to me, had to take all the doors off the hinges, cut out middle, and put a window, right? So that even if the doors were closed, people could see into the office. And it
Mm-hmm.
could feel like, man, that's a really extreme. But I think a different perspective is it is extreme in that the desire to protect people from their worst moments was
That's good.
extreme, right?
That's
And
good.
so, at my best, I'm not drawn to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
But boundaries aren't about what am I at my best. Boundaries are protecting me when I'm at my worst. When we
Yeah.
had a major fight, when we're not connecting, when I'm feeling lonely, do I
Mm-hmm.
have patterns and habits in place that still protect me and protect our marriage? So that
Yes.
staff, that church leadership team wasn't about everybody on staff's trying to have affairs. It was like, no, let's create transparency. Let's create an environment where people of the opposite sex can work and can have meetings, but know that there's a level of accountability that prevents or reduces the likelihood that a relationship goes beyond where it's supposed to go. Right.
Right.
And so for you and I, that's what the not being alone in a car, not being alone at a house, not being alone with people of the opposite sex is. It's an extreme boundary that makes it incredibly difficult for you and I to create emotional or physical connection with somebody else of the opposite sex. Because
Mm-hmm.
the reality is, I don't need to be emotionally connected to another woman. I don't
Mm.
need to be physically connected to another
What
woman.
if what if she was like your best friend? Because I think we deal with that. Some people have best friends that are the opposite sex that they bring into marriage.
Yeah, I mean, you and I are a little extreme, but I think that's a recipe for disaster personally. And because it gets back to not just protecting ourselves at our best, right? But
Mm-hmm.
protecting ourselves at our worst. When I hear that somebody has a best friend that is of the opposite sex, it makes me incredibly nervous because
Mm-hmm.
there's this bond. As people, we are created for relationship. And
Mm-hmm.
so if I am super close with somebody else and you and I are in a difficult season, like
Mm-hmm.
that's a threat to the health and the future of our marriage. That's what I see it. It's I am comfortable with this person, and maybe you and I are frustrated. I have a glass of wine. I have like
Yeah.
people make bad decisions. So sometimes when people push back on boundaries, it's like we forget some of the dumb things that we do. And the
Yeah.
point of boundaries is protect yourself from dumb things, protect yourself from a bad moment that has a forever impact. And that's what affairs are. Like they just erode trust and relationship. That moment breaks trust that is incredibly difficult to repair. And so, that's kind of like I wear my seatbelt. I've never been thrown out of the car. I still wear my seatbelt every day. Right.
Yeah.
So it's like, I'm not going to get in the car later today and be like, I am not going to crash. Like,
Right.
so there's a part of it where, it's more about planning and preparing so that when something happens, the impact has already been kind of neutralized prior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I recognize that when it comes to the opposite sex, sometimes we might work in a field that's dominated by one type of gender. And so it feels like it's unavoidable, to have certain meetings and just to have certain lunches and whatnot. But again, I think it's something just to be aware of, as far as if you are in proximity with the same person consistently, that's where the comfort comes in. And when we're comfortable, we let our guard down, because we're not being vigilant to, okay, what's going on? Am I representing myself how I want to be represented? Am I walking in integrity and keeping my marriage at the forefront of the interactions with other people? Because like I alluded to earlier, hurting people hurt people. And so
Yeah.
you might not be looking for anything, but other people are around you are walking around hurting. They're struggling in their marriage. And so they just want someone to take them to lunch and look eye to eye with someone who can see them. And that's all it takes. That's how it gets started. And when affairs happen, a lot of times it's this romanticizing thing, because it's not the reality, whether emotionally speaking or physically speaking. This person doesn't live life with you. They don't smell your stuff. They don't see the reality of the day to day that happens. So they don't even know the real you, but yet there's this romanticism surrounded around the secrecy and the fantasy, where it's really a imposture to what God really has for us in our marriage, which is to be known as yourself and be accepted.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that that's really good. I think it's so important that we remind ourselves of the target, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
When we keep the ideal target in mind, it's not that the expectation is we're going to hit the target every time, but it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
change what we pursue, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, marriage at its best is kind of what you're saying. It's being fully known, fully accepted, and fully
Mm-hmm.
loved, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
times where we fall short, we miss the mark, but it doesn't
Yeah.
change what we should pursue. And
Right.
so, even thinking about boundaries, Sarah Gale and I have our ideal boundaries, our clear boundaries. We don't spend time in any private environment with people of the opposite sex. So it's like, you're going to
Mm-hmm.
have a work meeting. Can you have it in a public place? It's hard to get freaky in public, right? Like, so you do things to protect yourself. But, if you work in an industry or an environment where you are regularly alone with people of the opposite sex, now what? How do you
Mm-hmm.
have a conversation with your spouse that builds trust, that promotes transparency? Because loneliness and secretness are kind of the foundations that are more likely to lead to affairs. So if we
Yeah.
can create transparency, if we can create accountability, if we can create openness and
Mm-hmm.
protective boundaries, then we're
Mm-hmm.
we're in a good spot. It doesn't mean our marriage is going to be perfect. There's other areas of communication and of intimacy and that are important to a healthy marriage. But
Yeah.
this is kind of defense. This is preventing kind of that thing that can really, really derail a relationship from taking place. And that's what affairs are. They really
Yeah.
derail and break trust. And it's just a massive uphill climb. And
Yep.
man, there are couples that do it, that they
Yeah.
they
For sure.
pursue and they persevere and they forgive.
Mm-hmm.
And it is incredible to see a relationship go through that restoration. But if
Yeah.
if you're not going through that, like, let's take steps to not have to go
Yeah.
through that. That's a journey we don't want people to have to experience. That's a journey that we personally don't want to experience.
And I feel like, Chad, we're so, I guess, intentional when it comes to this area, that I just think, oh yeah, this is just what we do, and it protects us. But when I share it with other couples, or when I listen to other couples and how they got to the place they are with affairs, it's something that just wasn't thought about, or something that was never taught to them. They just didn't know that this is what needed to be done. And so hopefully, if you're newly married, if you're listening, now you know that this is a conversation that needs to be had. And some things that you can ask yourself is, when it comes to the opposite sex, it's, can you be alone with them? Do you ride in a car with them? Can you do text messages back and forth? How often? what are you coming into agreement with when it comes to the opposite sex? That's what we want to know. And then also, can you have opposite sex friends? And hashing it out, because like Chad said before, it's not about what you just can't do it, you can't, like, it's not about you're a toddler and we put all these restrictions on you. I personally think boundaries are freedom, because for me, I love when a man might say, hey, let's just grab lunch or something. And I love being able to be like, oh, no thanks, I don't do that one-on-one. And that's, I will literally say, I don't
Yeah.
do that one on one. And for me in counseling, I don't counsel men one on one, because I know there's an emotional dynamic and I don't want them looking to me for that emotional substance when they have a wife that is made for that space. I want to model, even in my work, what I think is the most powerful thing that can exist, as far as a man and wife going to one another for those things. And so for me, I love having the clarity. We can call it clarity if
Yeah.
boundaries is triggering. I love having the clarity, knowing, nope, that's not something I need to do, because I've had other instances where I feel very uncomfortable when it comes to these interactions with the opposite sex, because I don't know where they're coming from. They don't know where I'm coming from, but one of us needs to know. And,
Yeah.
when that's me, then I know exactly how I'm handling different scenarios. And at the end of the day, I feel good about it. And I feel like my integrity is in check. My marriage is coming first. And there's that clarity there.
Yeah, that's so good. I mean, I forgot about the text messages that you and I don't, that's another thing we don't really do that I
Mm-hmm.
don't really think about. But that's another practical thing. We rarely or almost never text somebody of the opposite sex. Now, at this point, in full transparency, Sarah Gill and I do not have individual friends. Like, I do not have a friend with a girl that is not also Sarah Gale's friend. We obviously
Mm-hmm.
have other married couples where we are all friends, but the
Yeah.
husband or the man is my primary friend. And
Mm-hmm.
if I need to text his wife, one or both things happen. I put him on it so that it's a group text, or I put Sarah Gale on it, or
Mm-hmm.
I put both just so everybody's aware this communication is happening. I think that's a sign early on for us. If we are finding ourselves isolating and doing things in secret, that's an alarm that we're in a dangerous place when we're starting to do things that we don't want people to know about. And I think
Yeah.
that's something that we just try and prevent in general. Like, that's why for me, I know we have friends, like, they don't want their spouse to see their phone. Like, you take my phone all the time because you want
Yeah.
to take photos, or I don't know what you're doing. But it's so nice that, like, if I don't know where my phone is and I walk out and it's in your hand, like, I don't there's nothing for me to worry about. There's nothing
Yeah.
on there that, I don't have to worry about texting this girl or this or that. And so I think that's where over time, exactly what you're saying, those boundaries or that clarity actually becomes a tremendous amount of freedom.
Yeah. And so, I guess, kind of to land the plane a bit, when it comes to seeking that agreement with your spouse, it's really thinking about, what is health? What does health look like in our relationship? What do we feel would be integrous in our relationship? And sometimes, I just got to be honest, sometimes we can come into agreement with our spouse and we're in agreement, but the plan is very bad. And
Yeah.
that happens for a number of reasons. One of them, I feel like we talked about last week, where we're not comfortable saying what we mean and meaning what we say. We don't want our spouse to think we don't trust them, or we don't want, to come off as a certain way. So we don't speak what's on our heart. Even though something might make us uncomfortable, we're like, go ahead. It's cool if you go to a movie with Sally. Like, that's cool. You guys are friends. I'm cool with it. It's fine. And so, but meanwhile, over time, as so and so continues to go to the movie with Sally, that's going to be problematic. And so it's one of those things, if you don't feel comfortable with it, it's speaking up. And so, what I want to ask you, Chad, to maybe kind of end this, because I feel like we've been going a lot longer on this one, but when you don't agree, like, what happens when you don't agree on the boundaries? Like, if I think something different than what you would think.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's that's marriage, right? That's marriage communication. It's that dance of we see things fundamentally different. Now
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
On a practical level, um, I think this is where a third party person can be useful, whether that's a
Mhm.
counselor, whether that's a wise friend, somebody who cares about the marriage and the relationship and cares
Yeah.
about both people could be a great source of encouragement and wisdom to bring into that particular conversation. And then I think it's reflective listening. It's trying to understand your spouse's perspective and okay, if we can't accomplish the ideal,
Mhm.
what is the next best alternative? How do we
Yeah.
maximize the transparency and the comfort of both people in the absence of the ideal? So like maybe a basic example, because a lot of bad stuff happens in isolation and secret, right?
Mhm.
So this is unrelated, but our son came home from school and another parent picked him up and brought him home and then dropped him off. And you told him, hey, I wish I would have known you were getting in a car with somebody else.
Yeah.
And so had he text you, said, hey, I'm getting a ride with so-and-so's mom, and then later, hey, I'm home, right? So
Yeah.
let's say in an example, somebody's going to be in a car or be in a meeting or be somewhere with somebody else of the opposite sex. I personally, that's not ideal, but I think it protects the relationship if that person is proactive and says, hey, babe, I've got a meeting with so and so, right?
Mhm.
They're sharing the information. That already breaks some of the secretness, that already breaks the isolation. And then after, hey, meeting ended, I'm headed home, right?
Mhm.
That's a
Mhm.
very different feel I project as a spouse when I find out that my spouse was with somebody from them as
Yeah.
opposed to somebody else. Hey, I saw Chad in the car with Susie the other day. What were they doing? And you're like, hey, what? Like I have no, like that's a different feel. And so I think, if you're going to miss that ideal, talking through how do you create transparency and build and maintain trust? I think that
Yeah.
becomes kind of the target that you're then looking for.
Okay. And it's all about honoring one another. It's not because we have to, because we don't trust each other. It's because we want to. We want to keep our spouse in the loop. We want to make sure that as much as it depends on us, we are being open and honest with the things we're doing. If you're talking to your spouse, they're like, I don't care what you do. Okay, then maybe don't share it with them. And then that's one of those things where it's like, it's a plan, but I don't know if it's the best plan. But still, it's checking in and touching base with each other consistently because sometimes the boundaries might need to change, sometimes they'll change. But before a change happens, that conversation needs to happen because when we are in agreement about a boundary and one of us breaks it without checking in with the other person first, that breaks trust. And so we want to be in relationships where we can trust one another. And we're not perfect. So we're going to mess up sometimes. And that's where the grace comes in. But at the same time, as much as it depends on us, let's do our best to honor the agreements that we make and the words that we say.
Yeah, that's good. I like it.
Anything else to add?
No, that is it. I have nothing else to add at this moment.
Okay. All right. Well, hopefully you got something that helped you in from this segment, and we'll continue talking about boundaries in relationship, not with the opposite sex per se, but just some other areas that we think are helpful just to think about, consider, and we look forward to continuing to help you grow in your marriage. It always helps us to grow when we're talking about these things and helps us to remember, okay, yeah, these are some of the things that we have said as well to hold us accountable. So thank you indirectly for holding us accountable to our own agreements and what we believe in. So last thing I guess I want to say is what I always say is there is always, always hope